We have Selena Tan. Selena is from Cambridge, Massachusetts.
Hi,
Hello.
Selena.
My name's Anna. I'm calling in from Lancaster, Pennsylvania.
For those of you who just joined, we're just waiting a few more minutes as people join. But if you would like to put your name and location in the chat box so we can know who you are and where you're from, we're welcome to do that. For those of you who just joined, we're just waiting a few more minutes as people join. But if you would like to put your name and location in the chat box so we can know who you are and where you're from, we're welcome to do that.
We have Yang tuning in from Toronto, Canada. Yang, which is if you could vote in the US election. Sorry, Yang. Alas.
Thanks for being interested enough to join this conversation. Hello, Carol.
Yang tuning in from Toronto, Canada. Yang, which is if you could vote in the US election. We have Mia Antonio from Los Angeles on YouTube. Mia is
Thanks for being interested enough to join this conversation. All right, great. So I know other people will be joining over the next few minutes, but we're going to go ahead and get started. So hi to everybody who is on Zoom, and hello also to the folks that are tuning in over YouTube. My name is Laura Hesse Fisher. I'm the founder and director of Civic Series. For those of you who don't know, we are a volunteer-led nonprofit organization that helps you understand, think for yourself, and have meaningful conversations about the most the next few minutes. But we're going to go ahead and get started. And our events like this one allow you to ask questions of experts in a nonpartisan and safe space. So the goal of today's event is to help us all understand where and when our votes really matter the most. I just want to say to begin with that we're of course always encouraging people to vote. So this in no way is telling you your vote doesn't matter and you should not go out and vote. I want to make that very clear. We actually had our Facebook ad rejected for that reason. They thought that we might have been doing voter suppression. And I realized for people who doesn't know us and know what we're about, they might interpret things that way. But I want to let you know that that's not what we're about. We're here to have your voices and your opinions heard. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay. Anna, can you see that all right? Great. All right. So I want to first thank our donors, the Rhyme and Reason Fund, the Boston Foundation, Dan and Amy Harris, Ross and Jane Kepner. And I want to share that we are, as I mentioned, we're a volunteer-led organization. Your donations to Civic Series go very, very far. We are putting in the chat a link to our Venmo and our PayPal account. If you did not donate when you register, we very much encourage and invite you to do that. You allow us to continue running events like this because even though we offer them for free, they do cost some money to run. So really appreciate your contribution in helping keeping this alive. So let me tell you a little bit about how this evening is going to go. So in a moment, I will introduce our speaker, who we will have a bit of a fireside chat to give a 20 to 30 minute overview of the topic. We'll then jump into a Q&A session to answer your questions, and that will be the majority of our time. We'll have 30, I wrote 40 to 30, I should have written 30 to 40 minutes of Q&A. And then what we'll do, something a little different if you've joined us before, we're going to have quick breakouts at 8 p.m. so you can talk with the other people here about some of the issues that we've talked about today. And then we are going to continue the Q&A afterwards for as long as you like, but up until 8:30. So if you have additional questions after that breakout, we will continue to answer them then. So Anna, let me turn it over to you to share about how people can ask their questions.
All right. Thanks, Laura. So, as you know, we have everyone muted when they came into the Zoom call. So when you have a question, put it into the Zoom group chat. I will take a look at it, and once the Q&A time comes, I will ask you to unmute yourself so you can ask that question live. And so we really invite you to turn your video on. We love to see your faces. It lets us know we're joined by people from all around the nation, and even in Canada as well. So I invite you to turn your video on. And if you're watching on YouTube, you can either put it in that YouTube chat on the right side of the video, or you can call or text into the number that I'm going to put in the YouTube chat and in the Zoom chat. So you can text the number that I'll put in, and then you can ask your questions by submitting it there if you would not, if you prefer not to ask it live. And once we get to the Q&A session, I'll take over and be moderating that portion. So back to you, Laura.
Thanks, Anna. So one thing I want to emphasize is that there is no such thing as a dumb question at Civic Series. The point of Civic Series is to ask the questions that you fear are too dumb to ask anywhere else. And I volunteer to be the dumbest person in the room as I moderate the session. We give you ways to ask your questions anonymously, so feel free to do that. Okay, great. I am with much pleasure to introduce our guest expert today. Dr. Elaine Kamarck is the director of the Center for Effective Public Management at the Brookings Institution. She's also a lecturer in public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. She focuses her research on the presidential nomination system and American politics at large. Elaine, we are so pleased to have you join us today. Oh, what? We have to unmute you. Okay. Anna, there we go. We're so pleased to have you join us.
Thanks for having me.
Is there anything you'd like to say before we begin?
No, let's get right into it. It's a big day in politics, so we've got lots to talk about.
All right, great, thank you. So our big question tonight, the hook is, does my vote matter? But also there are lots of elections, right? And so there are some basics we need to cover before we can really answer that question. So our first question to you is, what are the different types of elections that we can vote in?
Well, boy, oh boy, that's a big question because there's a lot of different elections in the United States. The ones that get the most attention are federal elections, and those are elections for people who govern the federal government. But those elections are mirrored in every state. So every 2 years, we elect members of the House of Representatives. Every 6 years, we elect some portion of the United States Senate. And every 4 years, we elect the president and the vice president of the United States. This hasn't changed much since the beginning of the Republic. The founding fathers said we're going to have congressional districts based on population. And then in a grand compromise, they said every state will have 2 senators regardless of how many people they have in the state. And this is something we'll come back to because it's a cause of great consternation these days. But that was a compromise because back then, the states were really people were more attached to their state than to this thing called the United States of America. That was kind of new. They really didn't get it back then. So in order to keep the Delawares and the South Carolinas and the other small states in the game, they gave everybody 2 senators regardless of population. Now, if you want to have a look we can put up that nifty map we just found, Laura. Want to do that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, let me get that up on my screen here.
So what Laura's going to put up here is a map that shows the distribution of congressional seats across the United States by state. And this distribution is done every 10 years. So these are the congressional districts that were awarded to the states based on the 2010 census. As you know, we're having a 2020 census right now. So in the 2022 elections, some of these numbers will change. And one of the things to note about this is look at these states with big, big, big territory. Like up there, look at Montana. It has 1 congressional district. North Dakota, South Dakota, Wyoming, they all have one congressional district. Tiny little Delaware over there on the East Coast has one congressional district, as does Vermont. These are places with just very few people in them. And but what the Constitution says is every state gets at least one congressional district. And then you see that there are states that are extraordinarily populous. The most populous state, of course, is California, followed by Texas, followed by New York. That didn't used to be the case. There was a point in time when New York was the most populous, and there was a point in time when Texas wasn't even in the top 3. But this is the picture today. In 2022, the Congress will get a new assortment of districts, and then what will go on is within those states, the legislature, and again, this is in the Constitution, is going to draw the lines of the congressional district. Now, this is where lots of funny business and lots of politics goes on, and it's quite controversial. Obviously, if you're in Alaska, look at Alaska down there, there are no lines to be drawn. You've only got one member of Congress. And in states like Idaho, New Hampshire, Maine, they're pretty small states. But once you get a couple members of Congress, what they try to do in the legislature is the political party that's dominant tries to get itself the best arrangement of districts. And this is known as gerrymandering. Again, gerrymandering is not new. It is named after a guy named Eldridge Gerry from up here in Massachusetts, where I am. And it's been around ever since the 1800s. Nothing new about it. And the only actual new thing is that instead of doing it in the old days with paper and pencil and counting, trying to add up the people in each district, these days they've got supercomputers that come out with all the permutations. So why don't we look at a gerrymandered district? You want to do that? And yep. Laura, if you would show us. Okay, so here's North Carolina. Look at the first congressional district. It's blue. That is a big Democratic district. Any Democrat in there is going to win by 10 percentage points. By drawing the district like that, look at district number 2, right? What they did is they carved out, they drew this district in such a way that they packed all the Democrats in. Now, obviously it was a Republican legislature that was drawing these lines, and that was gerrymandering on their part. They wanted to pack all the Democratic voters in one district so that the adjacent districts could be safe Republican districts. This is very controversial, this practice of gerrymandering, but it is as old as the country. And there were a bunch of Supreme Court cases on it in the last couple of years. And the court consistently just doesn't want to get into this business. They just don't want to get into the gerrymandering business. So they've really stayed away from it. They haven't forbade it. And so this will continue, my guess, in 2020 or 2022. So that's it. That's our districts. Now, just to complicate the matter more, this is presidential politics and federal politics. But the same thing happens at the state level. So the states they don't have a president, they have a governor, and they have state legislative districts and state Senate districts, state House districts. So, it gets really confusing here, right? You've got a congressional district, but the state Senate districts may cross the congressional district lines. They may not fit neatly into a congressional district. They're different. And so you'll find that sometimes a state senator, if the state senator's district happens to coincide sort of nicely with a congressional district, that state senator turns out to be a really strong candidate for Congress, right? Because they've been dealing with the same people for their political career. A state senator whose district maybe has 3 congressional districts in it, you know, kind of coming together. Not such a strong candidate for Congress because they don't have a big base. But state legislatures are the jumping off points for Congress, and they're the jumping off points for statewide elected office, which is governors, secretaries of state, and attorneys general, et cetera. So just to make it really complicated, but think of it this way, we've got a federal system with federal elections, and we've got a state system with state elections. And the federal government worries about the military and defense and all of those things. The state governments worry much more about education, about health and safety, about highways, etc. You know, I'll just tell you this as an aside. Presidential candidates sometimes talk as if they're running for governor, okay, because they want to talk about things that people really know and care about. So I remember in 2000, I campaigned with Al Gore, and both Al Gore and George Bush ran around the United States as if they were running for chairman of the school board. The federal government contributes only 8% of the school budgets in the United States of America. The federal government doesn't have much to do with school policy at all. Doesn't have much to do with education at all. The president of the United States does not spend his day on education. He spends his days on foreign policy, frankly, and military and intelligence affairs. But we get a sort of warped view of this because when presidential candidates want to connect with voters, they want to talk about the things that the voters know about and care about. And so we get a little messed up, right? We get a little, we don't always clearly delineate our federal and our state governments.
But there are these, so that's interesting. So there are different kinds of district boundaries that are drawn, whether you're dealing with federal elections, right, electing for Congress, or state elections. And you're saying some of them are pretty similar, right? The lines are pretty similar, but some of them are quite different and maybe even have nothing to do with each other.
Well, they wouldn't have nothing because every state Senate district, for instance, is in a congressional district, right? Usually the state Senate and legislative districts they're generally smaller than the congressional districts. So they're all going to be, in other words, there's no state Senate district that doesn't have a congressman, but they could have 2 congressmen, right? Depending on where the lines are drawn in that state. So it gets a little complicated.
So who draws the lines? You started answering this, but who picks how the lines are drawn and that contributes to gerrymandering in some cases?
In the state legislatures. Okay, so, and that is in the Constitution. Now, some states, there's about 11 at my last count. Some states voted to give the line drawing to an independent board. And the thought was that you would reduce the amount of gerrymandering by giving it to an independent board, taking it away from the politicians. So some states do that, and they've drawn slightly more competitive districts. But it's in the Constitution. I mean, the state legislature has that power to draw both sets of lines. They draw the lines for the congressional district, and they draw their own lines for state legislative, Senate and House of Representatives districts.
And is there one party that does this more than another party?
Nope. They are equally bad or equally good, no, depending on how you look at it.
So Democrats, Republicans, they both do.
There's a district in Maryland that was gerrymandered by the Democrats to try to shove all the Republicans into one district, right? There's a lot of districts in the South that have been gerrymandered by the Republicans to try to pack all the Democrats in one district. And as I say, this has been going on since 1800. So this is not anything new. Now, you know, let me make a comment. You will see people focusing on gerrymandering as if it's the entire problem in the United States, and if only we could get rid of it, you know, we would have more competitive elections and things would be better. It really, I mean, it is a problem, but it's not the whole problem. The second thing that has happened in the 20th century and the late 20th century and in the 21st century is what we call demographic sorting. So people move we're a very mobile society. People move to live near people like themselves. So we first saw this in the 80s and 90s with the gay and lesbian community, where people would move into neighborhoods that where they could feel comfortable holding hands with their partner going down the street. And so it sort of made sense. And so you'd have a lot of historic neighborhoods being gentrified as gay men moved in and lesbian couples moved in, and it made sense. It happens on the other in all sorts of groups. In Nashville, Tennessee, and around Tennessee, there's a lot of Christian homeschoolers. And if you're homeschooling your children, you want to be near a lot of other families homeschooling so your kids can have friends and you can do activities together, etc. So people moved to Tennessee in the late 1990s lots of homeschoolers moved there. So we tend to want to live in neighborhoods where there's people like ourselves. We don't move for political reasons. We move for lifestyle, values reasons, etc. But it has political consequences. So there's only so much that fixing gerrymandering can do. We're still going to have a lot of Cambridge, Massachusetts, where it's very, very liberal. You can barely find a Republican. We're going to have, places where you can barely find a Democrat, some places in Arizona, some places in the Midwest and the West. We're still going to have that, even if we had no gerrymandering.
So I want to lead us to the next question, which is about swing states. So this is related to gerrymandering, right? Because if you do gerrymandering, there'll be fewer swing, or I guess districts, fewer swing districts. Okay, tell us about that.
No. Okay. We talk about swing states in the presidential election because presidential election is determined by the Electoral College. What is the Electoral College? Each state has a certain amount of votes in the Electoral College. And the votes are equal to its senators and its congressmen. So let's take Wyoming, 1 member of Congress, 2 senators. Wyoming has 3 Electoral College votes. Take California, 53 members of Congress, 2 senators. So California has 55 electoral votes. In almost all the states, there's 2 exceptions, the Electoral College votes are awarded on a winner-take-all basis. So if you win California, you get 55 electoral votes. You win Wyoming, you get 3 Electoral College votes. Since we're in a sort of polarized era in our history, and people live near people like them, and states tend to be kind of deep red or deep blue, what happens is that our presidential elections, instead of being run in all 50 states, they're really we sort of compete in just a handful of states that we call the purple states or the swing states. So take Wisconsin, okay, Michigan, Arizona now. These are states that are going to be very, very important in the presidential election. What won't be important? California won't be important, because we know California is going to go in the Democratic column. We know New York and Massachusetts are going to go in the Democratic column. We know that the Dakotas are going to go in the Republican column. Indiana's going to go in the Republican column. In other words, we know and now these things change over time, but at any given point in time, you can pretty much take 30 to 40 of the states in the United States, and you can say, that's going Republican, that's going Democratic, which is why then we're left with a handful of states, probably around 10, where the election is decided. So if you're living in Massachusetts now, right, like Selena and I do, right? If you're living in Massachusetts, you don't see any Trump commercials. You don't see Biden commercials. You just don't see any, right? If you're living in Wisconsin, not only are you seeing the commercials till you're sick of them, but they've been calling you up for a month, right? And it's a dramatic difference. A lot of people don't like it because if you don't live in a swing state, you feel like your vote doesn't really count. On the other hand, the national vote is still important, and it absolutely does count. So people should still vote.
So are there swing districts as well as swing states?
There are swing congressional districts. That's right. So but again, those are a handful. It's very interesting. There are districts that flip. If it's a good year for the Democrats, the Democratic candidate will win. If it's a good year for the Republicans, the Republican candidate will win. Increasingly, there are very few of those. There's maybe out of 435 seats in the Congress, there's maybe 40 swing districts. That's really all there is. And part of that is gerrymandering, but part of that is our decisions as a people to live where we're comfortable, right? Live in neighborhoods where there's other people like us. What we find is that happens even regardless of income. So, for instance, for a long time, African Americans were forced to live in certain neighborhoods because nobody would let them live in other neighborhoods. As that started to change, Maryland has a county called Prince George's County, and Prince George's County is the highest income Black county in America. Why? Because lots of federal government workers, and federal government was integrated long before a lot other workplaces were, and people, when people could move out of Washington, D.C. to the city, sure enough, African Americans moved to live near other African Americans. And so that's a very powerful instinct to want to live near people like you. And we see it all over the place. And that's why there's so few swing districts.
That's pretty interesting. I wanted to ask a very tactical question, which is, how do I know what district or districts, right? Because how do I know what districts I'm in?
You just Google it and you put your town, put your city, and then say, what congressional district is Somerville, Massachusetts in? And it'll tell you, and then there's lots of pages on each congressional district. Ballotpedia has a page, Wikipedia has a page. There's lots of different pages, and they'll show you the map of the district, show you, where your town is in that district. Sometimes your whole town is in one congressional district. Sometimes the congressional district cuts your town in half or cuts your town in the third. It's really all over the place. And it'll describe the district, right? There are some districts that are very urban, some districts that are very rural, some are suburban districts. Obviously, though, that map we saw with Montana, the huge, huge state with one congressional district, well, Montana's a pretty rural state, as are many of those Western states, big, which is, by the way, why on election night, it's a little weird, because sometimes you could see an entire red map and the Democrats could be winning. Because those Midwestern Western states, they're just really big geographically, but not many people.
So the last question I had before we go into Q&A was about who can vote and who can't vote in the United States. And I know there are already some questions coming in about voter suppression, which we can talk about as well. So what does the Constitution say, and how does that match with what we see today?
Well, you have to be 18 years old to vote. For a long time, that was 21. They lowered it around the time of the Vietnam War. They lowered it to 18. You have to be an American citizen, either born here or naturalized, and a lot of people, as soon as they become a citizen, they register to vote. New immigrants are among one of the biggest voting blocs, because they're, very conscious of being an American and they want to participate. So, anybody who can vote who's over 18. Voter suppression is a different sort of thing. Voter suppression is activity that goes on behalf of one group or another to try to get the opposite group not to vote. And it basically happens when there is an identifiable group in an identifiable location that is not going to vote for your party. So for many years now, the Republicans have tried a variety of voter suppression techniques against African Americans. The reason is that while African Americans aren't that large a part of the United States population, they're only 11%. They vote overwhelmingly Democratic. They'll vote anywhere between 87 and 92% Democratic in a presidential election. So if Republicans can suppress that vote through a variety of means, then they stand a chance of, winning the state. And so that's what we most recently we see voter suppression geared towards African American voters. The Russians 4 years ago got into the voter suppression game too, and they not only helped suppress the African American vote, they also directed a lot of their messages, many of them false, towards Bernie Sanders voters. In other words, they looked at places where Sanders had beat Hillary, and they tried to suppress the Sanders vote, telling the Sanders people that you shouldn't vote for Hillary. She was crooked. She ran a pedophile ring out of a pizza parlor. I mean, all that stuff. And that was guaranteed at trying to suppress the Bernie Sanders vote. So if there's an identifiable group that votes in a certain way, voter suppression are techniques that are used against that group. And the techniques are all over the place. They vary. Sometimes they're in statute. Sometimes you have to have a certain form of identification to show up at the polls, and that tends to discriminate against lower income people. Sometimes it's just stuff like putting up big billboards saying, if you don't show ID when you vote, it's a felony. Well, that's just nonsense. Nothing about voting is a felony. So, I mean, it's just, so it's, they use scare tactics and actual legal suppression tactics. There's a big literature on voter suppression. It is a serious problem, but there's also a lot of awareness of it these days, and people fight back.
So just a follow-up question to that. You said that Republicans will use voter suppression tactics towards African Americans. Are there other kinds of voter suppression that we're seeing? I mean, you mentioned Republicans in particular. What about on the Democrat side or from others?
The problem is that it's not quite, at least in modern history, it's not quite equal. You know what I mean? Mostly because Republican voters have tended to be upscale and suburban voters. And it's very hard to scare them into not voting. They tend to know what their rights are, et cetera. So voter suppression tactics work best with communities that are, low income and low education, and and used to being, tormented by the police or by the authorities. And so it's easier to scare those voters than it is to scare the upscale Republican white voters. So that's why you've seen more of it on the Republican side. I don't want to claim total moral superiority for the Democrats, but I think it's a practical reason.
We're already getting into some pretty heavy topics, and I'm sure more will open up in the Q&A. So Anna, can I turn it over to you?
Yes. All right, and just going off of voter suppression, so I'm going to ask Carol. We'll unmute Carol your microphone, and then a couple of your questions revolved around voter suppression. Go ahead.
Okay.
It's actually Bill, but we were talking about voter suppression, Elaine, and there's a lot of people talking about it, obviously. I'm just curious to know from your perspective, in the states where people are recognizing this, Georgia maybe is a big one, what do you think that individuals can do to just make sure that their vote is not suppressed, and making sure that they have the opportunity to vote like they want to?
Well, I think it's pretty easy. And is that okay, Anna, if I go? I think it's pretty easy and pretty straightforward. First of all, make sure you understand the rules and regulations around voting. What do you have to bring with you to the polling place? Or if you want an absentee ballot, just make sure that you apply for it early enough, get your ballot, and fill it out exactly according to the letter of the law. It's because you don't want an excuse for somebody to throw out your ballot. So, for instance, there's all sorts of strange things. I usually vote absentee here in Massachusetts because I also spend a lot of time in Washington. And things happen like you have to sign the envelope that your ballot is in. And so sometimes people, they mark their ballot, they put it in the envelope, they put it in the other envelope, and they don't bother to sign the outer envelope. Okay, so all of a sudden you have, you're technically, you haven't voted correctly. So it's those sorts of things. And it's particularly important this year because we're going to have so many absentee ballots and so many people because of COVID-19 voting absentee for the first time in their lives. And as we saw in the primaries, a lot of people, there's just a lot of innocent mistakes. And if those innocent mistakes are occurring in a state that's contested, right, you're going to have a lot of people trying to throw out those votes, depending on who they think those votes would be for. So getting the actual details down correctly is really important. And helping your neighbors do the same thing. League of Women Voters, by the way, very, very good at this stuff. So there's civic groups like the League of Women Voters. And by the way, the political parties themselves, I mean, if they think you're their voter, they will be very helpful too, because they have all the incentives in the world to help you vote.
Sorry, Carol, can you unmute your microphone again? I'm sorry.
You have to myself. I have another question that's related to this. We are doing postcard campaigning with Neil over here through a group called Reclaim Our Vote. And the idea is to encourage people and support them in areas where we think that there is voter suppression. And I'm wondering if you're familiar with that and if you think that would be effective.
Well, I absolutely think it would be effective. I'm not familiar with it. The important thing, though, is that in your communications and in your postcards, you're giving accurate information about where they're voting, because that's where, I mean, see, that's where the rubber really meets the road. People look, the two parties, remember, they're competitors. So they're always looking for a way to get at the other party's voters. Right? And to throw out those votes if possible. And sometimes, there's a long history of dirty tricks in American politics. The most famous one is sending the other party's voters a letter or a postcard, or these days an email saying, the election is Wednesday, November the 4th. Right? That's an oldie but goodie, right? Just try to convince. And remember, not everybody's going to fall for it. But if you're
wrong date, they're giving them the wrong date.
They're giving them the wrong date, right? Not everybody's going to fall for it, but if you're in a close race and you get 3% to fall for it, it might be the difference in the election, right? They won't vote that day. So it's you've got to make sure that people really know how to do this. I'll give you a heartbreaking story from Florida in 2000 when I was working for Al Gore, and the Florida election, as you know, was very close, and the whole presidential hung on it. What we discovered afterwards, when the media did a full recount of the state, and this was after the Supreme Court ruled, what we discovered was that in Jacksonville, and Duval County, where Jacksonville, Florida is, there were in the poor neighborhoods, which were African American, people had done the following. They had checked Al Gore, and then down in the write-in section, they had written Al Gore, exclamation, exclamation, exclamation. Well, when the machines read that, those votes were thrown out. Why were they thrown out? It was double voting. You're not allowed to vote for more than one person, you see? Now, had that been a hand recount, which, again, this is a strategic mistake the Gore people made, which was to not go for a full state recount. The law clearly says that when you look at a ballot, you have to determine the intent of the voter. Well, the intent of those voters was pretty clear, but As far as the scanner was concerned, those were double votes and the ballots were invalidated. So that's the sort of thing you got to tell people to do, be careful for that sort of thing. I mean, it's very nice to allow somebody to write in someone's name, but not if it invalidates your whole ballot.
All right, we have a question from Ryan. Ryan, I'm gonna unmute you right now. Your screen should be asking you to unmute yourself, and then you can ask your question live.
Hi, this is Ryan from beautiful Somerville, Massachusetts. I have a short, hi neighbor. I have a short two-part question, which would be, is there punishment for gerrymandering to the politicians who engage in it? And do the people have any power to stop gerrymandering? Thank you.
No punishment that I've ever heard of for people who engage in it. None at all. I mean, it's perfectly legal, it's actually in the Constitution, etc. One way to change it, however, which some states have done, is that there have been ballot propositions put on to create these nonpartisan line drawing commissions. And those have won in a bunch of states. Those have won, and they've taken the gerrymandering out of the hands of the state legislature and the politicians. So that's basically the one way I know of to stop it. But it's in the Constitution, and this time around, I mean, people went to the Supreme Court and tried to get the court to weigh in on this, and it's perfectly legal. So the only way to really get around it is try to get the public mobilized enough to set up one of these nonpartisan commissions.
So when you say it's in the Constitution, you mean that state politicians can draw the lines?
Yeah.
That they have the authority to do that, and they can do it whatever way they see is fit to do it.
You betcha. I mean, remember that when the founding fathers were making up the Constitution, right? This was a very rural country, and people's attachment was to the state, not to the United States of America. And so the Constitution gives a lot of authority to states to do lots of things. And, initially, what did the United States government do? It had a Navy that tried to stop pirates from taking over its ships when its ships were, engaging in trade. And it had a post office, ran a post office. Other than that, as far as normal Americans in, 1825 were concerned, their state did everything. And ironically, today, most of the things that we care about government doing, the state does. Now, these days, the state does it, and they get lots of money from the federal government, because the federal government's like a great big ATM machine when it comes to the states. They're always handing them money. But most of what we think of as that we care about as government is really still state power.
All right, we have a question from Molly. Molly, I will ask you to unmute yourself and go ahead.
Hi, I was wondering why we haven't already switched to digital voting. I think that's a hot topic right now. And do you think it will ever happen in the near future where we're able to either vote from our phones or our computers?
Not in the near future. No, it is too vulnerable. It is way too vulnerable. When you have an entire country called Russia with some of the best computer hackers in the entire world seeking to mess up our elections. Even before the pandemic, the reforms that were going on in states were reforms that would create paper ballots, even after you voted electronically. And those paper ballots were to be left there at the polling place, because that way, if you needed a recount and the thing had been hacked into electronically, you had a paper trail of the votes. So one of the just sort of weird things that's happened this year is the irony is that the pandemic actually solves the problem that we were most worried about before the pandemic. What we were most worried about before the pandemic was hacking into state election systems and changing votes or changing counts or whatever. Well, now what's going to happen is at least 50%, if not more, of the ballots are going to be paper ballots mailed in and collected. What happens then? Well, there's a giant room with a lot of police protection around that room. And there are officials counting the ballots, and there's a representative from each political party watching the ballot count, and there's hordes of lawyers ready to go to court at the slightest thing that they think is wrong. And Boris and Svetlana can't get into that room. They can get into the transmission, they can hack into the systems, they can't get into that room. So until we have a much, much more secure internet and electronic, transmission system, we're not going to have electronic voting. It's just too easy to hack, and we have too many players around the world that want to mess with our elections. In this coming election, by the way, it's the Russians want to interfere on behalf of Trump. The Chinese want to interfere on behalf of Biden. So this could be a real free-for-all.
All right, we have a question from YouTube. So this question is from Katrina Green. And so Katrina asks, how do college students go about voting in their college state? Do they have to re-register to vote and say that it's a change of address with their new college address? They're wondering how college students vote.
Yeah, well, you can do that, or you can keep your permanent address, your parents' address, and apply for an absentee ballot. Either way is legitimate. You can't vote twice. You can't vote in college and vote at your parents' address. Don't do that. But if you do want to vote in your college town, you do have to register to vote. And if you want to get an absentee ballot, you need to register at home. A lot of people who have the option of voting in two places sort of look to see, remember I talked before about those purple states, right? They sort of look to see, well, what are the competitive states? If you're going to college in Massachusetts and you're a Democrat, maybe you don't want to vote. Maybe you'd rather vote in you're from, I don't know, Missouri or Wisconsin. Maybe it's better to vote absentee in Wisconsin, so your vote counts more. So anyway, so people have to make that decision. But the important thing is, don't do this and don't try to vote in two places. People get in trouble for that.
All right, we have a question from Neil. Neil, I will mute you and you can go ahead and ask your question. I think you have to.
Yeah, sorry. Hi, Elaine. Thanks for talking to us. Coming from Lexington, Massachusetts, so close by.
It's on here,
I am looking to try and figure out how to solve this problem. And, just given the lack of political agreement on the main problem with voting, my Republican friends talk about all this rampant, voter fraud. My Democrat friends believe that there's rampant voter suppression. And many voters, believe that their votes, I know people in Massachusetts who are smart, intelligent people who don't vote because they feel like it just doesn't matter because they're not in a swing state. I'm wondering, how do you think we can fix our democracy and have a fair election process that everyone on both sides of the aisle can trust? Is it a legislative fix? Is it having to get the facts out about whether there is really voter fraud or voter suppression? Or is it, what is it? Is it undoing what the Supreme Court did with Shelby County versus Holder? What is the fix here?
Well, part of this is just, let me just start with the facts. There's very little voter fraud. There really is. I mean, I have an article that you can look at on the Brookings website about voter fraud. And what I did in that article is I used data that the Heritage Foundation had collected. They're a right-wing think tank. And I'll give you a perfect example. Oregon has voted by mail for 2 decades. And over that 2 decades, they have tens of millions of votes. The Heritage Foundation, which clearly was trying to support Trump, found 8 instances of voter fraud. 8. I mean, come on. And most of those weren't like big organized things. It was like a man's wife died. He got her absentee ballot he got her ballot in the mail, and he voted her ballot and his ballot. What was amazing to me when I looked at these instances was that they even got caught in the first place. So clearly people are watching this. So first of all, just the facts out there. There just isn't massive voter fraud, and there isn't massive voter fraud when it comes to mail-in ballots. This is a Trump fantasy, just like drinking bleach will, cure COVID-19. It's just another Trump fantasy that serves his interest. And I think you make a good point, Neil. The voter suppression is not nearly as widespread as Democrats would have you believe. Okay, we get huge turnouts in Democratic states, okay, and enormous numbers of Democratic votes. California alone is responsible for huge numbers of Democratic votes. There's not much. I mean, there is voter suppression, and there has been much worse voter suppression. So I don't want to minimize it, but again, you're right. Both parties tend to kind of get a little carried away with this, and I think simply telling people how to vote and making sure they do it right, making sure they do it right and make sure they don't listen to somebody who's telling them something that's nonsense, is probably just the best way to defeat that. And you got to do it, you got to do it in one neighborhood, one county at a time. It's not something that, there's no easy fix. There's not a legislative fix, by the way, because again, going back to the Constitution, one of the things it gives the states is states run voting systems. We don't have a federal voting law. Well, we have some laws, but we don't have a federal voting system where everybody has to vote the same. The determination of how to vote, when to vote, all that stuff, that's all state by state, all state law. And sometimes it's even county by county. So, once again, this goes back to the framers, going back to really seeing the USA as a confederation of states.
Elaine, I wanted to follow up on that. Neil mentioned that he had a friend who doesn't vote because he doesn't live in a swing state. What was your response to that?
Well, I think it still matters because I think the national vote still matters. Okay, the margin still matters. Hillary Clinton beat Donald Trump by 3 million votes nationally. Now, most of those votes were Californians voting. So even though they knew their state was going to go Democratic, they still voted. When the national vote still matters, it gives a sense of legitimacy to the person who wins, and it gives a question around the person who didn't win. I mean, Donald Trump has been, freaked out by this from the day after the election. First, he tried convincing everybody in America that actually he would have won the popular vote except for all the illegal Hispanics who voted, right? And there's no evidence of that. I mean, it's very hard to vote if you're an illegal staying in the United States. And think about it for a minute. If you're here illegally, you try to stay away from government. You try to stay from all kinds of government. Why on earth would you go vote? I mean, it's just like asking for trouble, right? So, I mean, this notion that there are hundreds of thousands of illegal immigrants voting is just sort of ridiculous on the face of it. But Trump has been obsessed by that because obviously it undermines his legitimacy. And so the popular vote still matters, not to mention the fact that you've got all these down ballot races. Okay, so you've got other things to vote for besides president. We're so presidential centric in this country that I think we forget about the importance of the other races, and we sometimes give the president more power than in fact he actually has.
Yeah, that's very interesting, and it dovetails on your point before that, a lot of these decisions that we're talking about, even in our conversation today about how to affect some of these laws, are really on the state level. And that influences our daily life more than the federal level does.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
So we have time for probably one more question before we go into the breakouts. We're going to do the breakouts, and then we're going to come back and we can answer more questions then. Anna.
All right. So our last question, we have Yang. Yang, go ahead. Ask your question live. You have to unmute yourself.
Thank you, Anna. And thank you for giving the last question to a Canadian. Anyway, so thank you, Elaine, for the interesting presentation. bit of a whirlwind. You mentioned that there were 2 exceptions to the winner-take-all rule. I believe it was in the congressional district or something like that. What are those exceptions?
The state of Maine and the state of Nebraska. So each state has 4 electors. They have 2 congressional districts, so 2 congressmen, and then they have 2 senators. In those 2 states, if you win the congressional district, you get the elector from that district. The statewide winner gets the 2 electors, the 2 senators. So for instance, if the 1st congressional district of Maine goes for Biden and the 2nd congressional district goes for Trump, but the whole state goes for Biden, Maine will cast 3 electoral votes for Biden and 1 for Trump. You see?
Okay.
So they're the only 2 states that do that. By the way, there's nothing in the Constitution that says that states have to award their electors winner take all. Nothing, absolutely nothing. But states have just traditionally done that as a winner take all. And there's a movement, periodically there's a movement to award electors by congressional district, the way Maine and Nebraska do. The problem is that the last time there was that movement, it was a movement to do it in California. And wait a minute, who do you think was behind that? Republicans were behind that. Democrats stopped it, right? Because as it is, Democrats usually get 55 electoral college votes, but there are Republican districts. So, Republicans could get 10 of those electoral college votes. Democrats have thought of doing it in Texas, right? Because while Texas generally goes Republican, there are definitely there's a big state, so there's a fair number of Democratic districts in Texas. So, but basically, unless everybody did it at the same time, right, which would be hard to orchestrate, it's probably not going to happen.
Right. So that would take quite a bit of reform.
Yeah, yeah. Well, here's the problem. When something is a state power, right, and the 10th Amendment to the Constitution is all about state power. When something is controlled by states, the feds can't tell the states what to do. And the notion that you're going to get 50 state legislatures and 50 governors all doing the same thing at the same time, pretty hard to do.
United States, not so united in some respects. And I have a related question, if it's allowed. Might be wishful thinking. Do you think, in your opinion, that the U.S. could ever try proportional representation?
No.
No? You'll have to explain what that is for us, though, first, Elaine.
Well, in parliamentary democracies, what happens is...
And what's a parliamentary democracy?
Okay, so parliamentary democracy is England, Canada, they're parliamentary democracies. And the way they work is when you go to vote, you vote for just the legislative seats. You actually don't vote for the prime minister, even though you know who it's going to be. You vote for the legislative seats. And in many parliamentary democracies, if the Labour Party gets 55% of the seats and the Tory Party gets 45%, then the Labour Party gets to run the government, and the leader of the Labour Party becomes the prime minister, even though there's no actual vote for the prime minister. So Israel is like this as well. There's a bunch of other democracies. It's a different way of organizing a democracy. It's quite legitimate. Americans tend to think the parliamentary democracy is better. A lot of parliamentary democracies think our system's better. It's kind of a grass is greener sort of situation. Whatever you don't have, you think that one's going to be better. But it's a very different system and a very different tradition. We went down that road for about 20 years in the beginning of the 1800s, where presidential candidates were nominated in the House caucus. And then we quickly, by 1831, stopped doing that and had conventions, which we have to this day. And so it was we sort of started doing that and then moved in a very different direction.
All right. So now we're going to move to our breakout rooms. So after I click the button, everyone will be separated into 1 out of 3 rooms. So very quickly, I'm going to put some of the questions just to prompt everyone in conversation. So first things, what's one thing that you learned? What's one question you still may have? And did anything change for you? What thoughts did you have coming in here that may have changed now that you've heard from Elaine here? So I'm going to click a button, all the rooms will open, and then eventually after a few minutes, probably about 5 to 7 minutes, there'll be a countdown of 2 minutes, and then that's when you know you'll be wrapping up. And the breakout rooms will close automatically once that time comes up. So I'm gonna click that button in 3, 2, and Yep, looks like everyone is back. Great. So before we go into additional Q&A time, Laura, is there anything we should know before moving on?
Yeah, well, I'll just say I hope that people found that valuable. Oh, can you still? Okay, I hope people found that valuable. It's the first time we had done that kind of breakout. We got some feedback from people if they wanted to do it. Seeing some thumbs up and some nods there, so that's good. I found our conversation to be really interesting, and there are a number of new questions that surfaced. So I'll send them to Anna so she can put them in the queue. But if everyone here is still available and people on YouTube are still watching, then let's keep going.
All right. So a question that I have is just for you, Elaine. Could you help us understand just the journey of a citizen's vote, more specifically for a presidential election, but what happens when, let's say, for example, I go to the polls, I cast my ballot, I put it in to the slot. Where does it go from there, and how does it make its way all the way up to count in my state? You have to
that.
There
Yeah.
it is. All right.
It goes from your polling place, right, to generally a county center, because counties generally set up the polling places, et cetera. And the counties aggregate the ballots and send them on to the state headquarters, usually in the state capitol somewhere. In the case of absentee ballots, they are counted there by actual people often using scanners. Sometimes there are ballots that are unclear. Those are called provisional ballots, and they're marked as such. Some states have provisions for calling the voter and saying, I can't tell who you voted for, or you didn't sign the outside of the envelope, and do you want to redo your vote, right? So the state will start then reporting election returns. And they generally report by precincts, although this year it's going to be different because there's going to be so many people voting by mail. We won't necessarily know where their precinct is. When you voted in person, you voted at the precinct level. So people will count your votes and start reporting them. Simultaneously,
I'm sorry, when you say people, who are the people doing this counting?
State election officials.
The election officials.
Yes.
So
every
government
state,
staff.
Oh yeah. Every state has a Secretary of State and a Board of Elections. And they have bureaucrats whose job it is year to year to run the elections and count the ballots. These people are pretty nonpartisan. They're pretty, that's their job, right? They could get fired for messing this up. So they take it pretty seriously. There's a state board of elections that runs elections. Now, when there's a very close election or a contested election, the thing gets lawyered up just like that. I mean, there are people running to the courthouses all over the place when it looks close and there's any suspicion of wrongdoing. Funny way our adversarial legal system here works to keep the election officials on their toes, because the two big political parties, let me just give you a figure. The two big political parties will probably have upwards of 50,000 lawyers working this election, mobilized, trained, armed with subpoenas, with depositions, et cetera, to run to court on election night or by 9 o'clock on the day after the election. So these things get fought out in the court. Every state has provisions for recounts. Some states is an automatic recount. If you're within too close of a margin, if you're like within 1%, automatically. Some states, a candidate has to call for a recount. Recounts are very expensive, so there's all sorts of rules about who pays for a recount, et cetera. But there's the reason that all this nonsense about our illegal elections is basically so much nonsense is that there are layers and layers and layers of people in the election business, right? And at the core are basically bureaucrats paid by the state to run elections year in and year out.
So we went to a question we have from YouTube. This was asked a little while ago, but wanted to make sure we got there. So this person's question, this is Mia. Mia asks, there is some chatter about the benefits of rank voting for state and federal elections. Does Professor Kmark think a method like this will gain more traction? What are the pros and cons? And I think we'll need to understand what rank voting is to begin with.
Yeah, it's called ranked voting. And basically, instead of just voting for one person, you get to vote for like 2 people, 3 people, depending on who's on the ballot. So you might say, let's suppose that there's an independent, there's a Green Party candidate, a Democrat, and a Republican. If you're a Democrat and you kind of like environmentalists, you might vote for the Green Party candidate first and then vote for the Democrat second, right? And then the votes are tabulated. When this was first talked about many years ago, people like me said, you can't do that. I mean, how on earth would you count those votes? Well, now everything's counted by computers and you can program the computer to count the votes, et cetera. The state of Maine has been using ranked choice voting. It works very well. And the nice thing about it is, the problem in elections is we're always drawn between voting our head and voting our heart, right? This is particularly true in primaries, right? Like in primaries, a lot of people, obviously, they really loved Bernie Sanders. They really loved Elizabeth Warren, but they just didn't think he could win. And they wanted to get rid of Trump. So they voted for Biden. In a ranked choice voting situation, you would vote for, say, Bernie Sanders first or Elizabeth Warren first, and then you'd vote for Joe Biden. And if he got a huge number of second choice votes, he might win, might not. So ranked choice voting is particularly good in primaries. And Maine has been using it. There were a couple states that used it in the Democratic primaries. And I think we'll see more of it because the technology actually makes it much easier to sort this out and to count those votes.
Just a follow up to that, why haven't other states switched to ranked voting as well?
It's new, it's new, and people aren't quite sure it works, and the politicians who would have to make the change to it aren't sure if they'd win, right? So everybody's a little leery about it. It's a new idea. It's getting some traction, and I suspect it'll pick up. And as I say, it works particularly well for primaries, where the candidates, a lot of time in the primaries, the candidates are all, if you think about the Democratic primary, all those people up there kind of agreed with each other, but just more of this, more of that, et cetera. So it lets you make those finer distinctions in a primary.
Got it. So we have a question here. It says, kind of a question for clarification. So earlier in the talk, you said that Democrats are overly concerned about voter suppression. Can you speak more about that? Are there numbers of votes or another way we can know how much this is happening? Thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, you have to go case by case and election by election. It was very clear in Georgia in the gubernatorial race, this 2018, that there was a lot of voter suppression, that the Secretary of State there then, who was running to be governor and is the governor, made some rulings that were very detrimental to the votes of the Democratic candidate Stacey Abrams, and so you could see it there quite clearly, it occurs from time to time and place to place. Where you do see voter suppression. Obviously, we're somewhat past the days of severe voter suppression, which would be poll taxes, for instance, which they used to do in the South to hold down the Black vote. But again, you really do have to look state by state and election by election. There's some elections not affected by it at all, and some elections are deeply affected by it.
Great. So I think what I'd love to do is ask you for some additional resources on that. You mentioned some before, and we can mail them out to people afterwards if they want to read up more about that. I wanted to know if you could clarify does gerrymandering happen on the state level, the state districts as well, or does it just happen in congressional districts?
It happens anytime anybody is drawing lines, right? Anytime you're drawing lines within a state, whether it's to make congressional districts or to make a state Senate district or state House district, there is gerrymandering involved. The stakes are obviously higher, more money is spent, more effort goes into the congressional districts because it's the federal government, but it happens at all levels.
And can you just say again, why is gerrymandering bad? You're still allowing people to vote, right? Yeah. But why is it seen as a negative thing?
Well, let's go back to our North Carolina example, okay? By drawing the funny line so that you push all the Democrats into one district, what you essentially do is you deprive Democrats in other districts of the chances of winning. So that second district, which is there, imagine if that second district had more of those votes from the first district. It would be more of a competitive situation. And the reason, of course, we want more competitive situations is that we want closer races. We want people to really talk where most Americans are, and most Americans are in the middle. And so when you have these districts that are totally Democratic or totally Republican, you tend to get members of Congress from those districts who know they're never going to lose their general election, right? They're never going to lose in November. So what they do is they play to their far left or they play to their far right. We see this in the members of the Freedom Caucus in the House. These are the ultra-conservative Republicans. Those Freedom Caucus members, they don't ever worry about, they're not in districts where there's any Democrats. They don't have to worry about losing in November. And so surprise, surprise, you get a Mark Meadows, who's now chief of staff to President Trump, who absolutely refused to negotiate this last COVID bill, which would have kept the unemployment checks coming. And now people are going to lose a lot of money because of what Trump said is, as usual, completely wrong and illegal. But so people are going to lose a lot of money because you have this ideologue, okay, who said, oh no, we're not compromising at all. So if you wonder, the deeper issue here is the loss of the ability to compromise. I'm old enough, and some of you on this call might be old enough, that we can remember a Congress where people made deals. They negotiated, right? You know, if you had one party wanted $3.6 trillion and the other party wanted $1 trillion, guess what? You came in at $2 trillion, right? You found the way in the middle to make it work. When you have too many Mark Meadows, and they exist on the Democratic side too, by the way, when you have too many people like that, they only play to the galleries. They only play to their most extreme members. And that constrains their ability to compromise. And once you constrain the legislative body's ability to compromise, you're screwed, right? You're screwed. They can't do anything. And we see a lot of that in this Congress. And then we've seen a lot of this in the last 10 to 20 years.
That was a really great response. Thanks, Elaine. I think that covered a lot of ground. So we're nearing the end of our session. So I want to just ask two final questions. So where would you say that votes count the most, whether it's geographically or in which kinds of elections?
Well, they always count, right? They definitely count in the presidential election because they confer legitimacy. Even if you're not in a swing state. The number of votes confers legitimacy. They count an enormous amount at your local level and at your state level because that's where you're likely to be requesting services. I live here on Cape Cod, as many of you figured out. I'm from Massachusetts, and I vote here, even though the other option is to vote from Washington, D.C. Now, nationally, it doesn't make any difference. They're both Democratic entities. You know, neither one is a swing state. Why do I vote on Cape Cod? Because I'm an environmentalist. I want to vote on land use issues. I want to make sure that the Cape stays as pristine as we can keep it. You know, that's why I choose to vote here. So my important votes are like literally the town council votes and state rep votes, et cetera. I don't want the developers, taking over. So, so people, when you vote locally, that tends to reflect your actual day-to-day interests. And your national votes tends to reflect your values. Okay, what kind of country we want to be, things like that. So that's, I think, why all voting, frankly, is important.
This is a question that came up in the chat as well, but just to close it out, let's say your friend, your best friend says to you, I'm not going to vote in this election. It doesn't matter. What would you say to them?
I'd say you better vote. You better vote because it always matters. It always matters because the total votes matter, the participation matters. There's a lot of issues on the ballot. I mean, and look, voting brings out issues that the politicians are afraid to deal with. Look at legalization of marijuana. That is, politicians weren't out front on that. That's been mostly done by referendum. Okay, mostly done by ballot propositions. And so a generation is changing all of our laws and attitudes towards marijuana because the politicians wouldn't do it. So there's just a lot of ways in which voting ends up mattering and doing things that otherwise don't get done.
Thank you very much. So with that, we're going to wrap up our session. Sharing my screen here. In the chat, we're going to post a link to a 1-minute survey. We'll also email it out. Please fill it out. We read each and every one of those. We want to know what you thought of this session and what we could do to improve future sessions, as well as what you want future sessions to be on, what topics you want us to cover. We are hard at work at organizing our events on locating structural racism in U.S. policy and understanding the healthcare debate. So make sure you are on our newsletter. If you registered for this event, then you are on our newsletter, or you can visit our website, civicseries.org, to make sure you're registered so you can attend and ask your questions from our experts from those events. I want to thank again Professor Elaine Kamarck for your time and your attention and your thoughtful answers to our questions tonight. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
And thanks everybody else for joining. Have a good night.
Bye, everybody. Good night.
Bye.